The storm raged like an unrelenting beast, howling through the trees and whipping the rain into furious sheets. Lightning crackled across the blackened sky, illuminating the narrow winding road for a brief instant. Edward Gray's luxury car roared through the storm, its engine humming with power as it fought against the elements. Inside, Edward's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his face set in a grim expression. The rain hammered against the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Late again, he thought, frustration flickering in his eyes. The road ahead curved sharply, but in the blinding rain, it was almost invisible. A split second later, the tires skidded on the slick surface. The car swerved violently, the headlights cutting erratic patterns through the darkness before the vehicle plunged off the road. A sickening crunch of metal and shattering glass echoed through the storm as the car slammed into a ditch and went still. Not far away, Maria, a young teenager wrapped in a thin, tattered raincoat, trudged along the side of the road. Her shoes squelched with every step, water soaking through the soles. She clutched a small cloth bag close to her chest, shielding it from the rain. Her face was pale, her eyes tired but alert. She was used to nights like these, walking home late after a long day of odd jobs to support her sick mother. The sound of the crash jolted her from her thoughts. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her wide eyes scanned the road ahead, and through the driving rain, she spotted the faint glow of headlights, flickering and unsteady. Without a second thought, she broke into a run, her feet splashing through puddles as she raced toward the wreckage. When she reached the car, her heart sank. The front was crumpled like a tin can, steam hissing from the hood. Rain dripped through the shattered windows, pooling on the leather seats. Inside, she saw a man slumped against the steering wheel, blood trickling down his temple. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Her gaze flicked to the back seat, where a sleek black briefcase lay open. Papers were scattered across the seat, and a photograph peeked out. A woman's face, serene and haunting, stared back at her. "Sir, can you hear me?" Maria called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. She tried the door, but it was jammed. Desperation surged through her. She yanked at the handle with all her strength, gritting her teeth against the cold metal. Finally, the door gave way with a groan, and she leaned inside, rain pouring in behind her. The man's face was pale, his breathing shallow but steady. "Stay with me," she murmured, her hands shaking as she unbuckled his seatbelt. She hooked her arms under his shoulders and pulled, the effort nearly knocking her off balance. He was heavier than he looked, but she didn't stop. Inch by inch, she dragged him out of the car and onto the wet ground. Her fingers fumbled as she pulled out her phone, dialing for help. "There's been an accident," she said hurriedly, giving the operator the location. As the distant sound of sirens pierced the storm, she knelt beside the man, shielding him with her coat. Rain plastered her hair to her face, and her breaths came in gasps. She glanced back at the car, at the briefcase, and the photograph. Something about it sent a chill down her spine, but she pushed the thought away. This was the moment that would change her life forever, a deep voice narrated, but she didn't know it yet. Moments later, the ambulance arrived, its red and blue lights flashing in the darkness. Paramedics rushed to Edward's side, checking his vitals and loading him onto a stretcher. Maria stepped back, her soaked frame trembling as she watched them work. She didn't notice one of the paramedics pick up the briefcase, tucking it carefully beside Edward. As the ambulance sped away, Maria stood alone on the empty road, the storm still raging around her. She had no idea that her act of bravery had set something far greater in motion. Edward's eyes fluttered open, the harsh white light of the hospital room piercing through his groggy disorientation. He winced, a dull ache radiating from his temple as fragments of the crash replayed in his mind. The storm, the curve, the moment of impact. The sterile beeping of the heart monitor echoed in the quiet room, grounding him in the present. "Mr. Gray, you're awake," came a familiar voice. Edward turned his head slowly to see his assistant, Robert, standing by the bedside with a tablet in hand and a look of relief on his face. "You gave us all quite a scare." Edward tried to sit up, but the effort made his head spin. What happened?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "You were in a car accident," Robert explained. "The paramedics said you're lucky to be alive. A teenager pulled you out of the wreck before the ambulance arrived. Edward frowned, the words barely registering. A teenager? Yes, Robert nodded. A young girl. She called for help and stayed with you until the paramedics arrived. Without her, it could have been much worse. Edward's brow furrowed. He struggled to recall anything about the crash, but drew a blank. Where is she now? She went home after the ambulance left, but she refused to give her full name. Only said her name was Maria. I've tracked her down, though, Robert added with a slight smile. I thought you might want to thank her. The scene shifts to Maria's world. In a dimly lit one-room apartment, Maria sat by her mother's bedside, carefully wringing out a cloth and dabbing it on her forehead. Her mother's breathing was shallow, her frail form barely shifting beneath the worn blanket. Maria's eyes were tired but filled with determination. The small apartment bore the marks of a life lived in hardship: peeling wallpaper, a rickety fan that clattered noisily, and a makeshift table piled with sewing materials and old books. Despite its state, the room felt warm, a reflection of Maria's love and care. After ensuring her mother was comfortable, Maria grabbed her bag and slipped out quietly, heading to her next job. Her life was a constant hustle, a series of odd jobs to scrape together enough money for rent, medicine, and food. As she walked through the bustling streets, her gaze occasionally lingered on people passing by, professionals in suits, families laughing together. A small smile flickered on her lips, but her eyes betrayed her longing. One day, she thought, one day, I'll give Mom a better life. The next scene cuts to Edward's mansion. Maria stood at the gates of the imposing estate, her simple clothes a stark contrast to the grandeur before her. She hesitated before ringing the bell, her hands clutching the strap of her bag nervously. A butler greeted her and led her through the sprawling halls, each step echoing off the marble floors. Edward waited in a sunlit study, seated in a leather armchair. His head was bandaged, but his piercing gaze remained sharp. As Maria entered, he rose, offering her a polite nod. You must be Maria, he said, his voice measured. Maria shifted uncomfortably. Yes, sir. I'm glad you're okay. I owe you my life, Edward said simply. If it weren't for your courage, I wouldn't be standing here today. Thank you, Maria flushed slightly, shaking her head. I just did what anyone would do. Not everyone would risk their life for a stranger, Edward replied, motioning for her to sit. Please let me repay you. Whatever you need, money, education, anything, I'll provide it. Maria hesitated, her hands tightening on her lap. I don't want money, she said finally, but if you're willing, I'd like a job at your company. I want to prove myself. Edward raised an eyebrow, surprised by her request. After a moment of silence, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. You're a brave one, aren't you? Fine. You'll start on Monday. Maria's eyes lit up with gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Gray. I promise I won't let you down. As she left the mansion, Maria glanced back at the imposing structure, her heart pounding. She didn't know it yet, but this was the first step toward a journey that would change her life forever. Maria stepped cautiously into the lobby of Gray Enterprises, her footsteps echoing softly against the polished marble floor. She clutched her bag tightly, the grandeur of the place making her feel even smaller. The space was alive with activity, phones ringing, heels clicking, muted conversations. Everywhere she looked, she saw confidence and sophistication. A receptionist greeted her with a practiced smile, though Maria couldn't help but notice the faint flicker of disdain. This way, the receptionist said curtly, leading Maria down a corridor lined with glass-walled offices. Executives glanced up from their desks, some exchanging whispers. Maria caught fragments of their conversations. She's the one Mr. Gray hired after the accident. Charity case. Let's see how long she lasts. Maria straightened her back, her steps firm. She knew what they thought of her, but she wasn't here to seek approval. She was here to prove herself. Her workspace was tucked in a quiet corner, a modest desk surrounded by the hum of activity. As Maria unpacked her things, she overheard more whispers. Can you believe it? No qualifications, no experience, just luck. Gray must have felt sorry for her. Maria gritted her teeth, forcing herself to focus. Let them talk. I'll show them what I'm capable of. The days were long and challenging, but Maria tackled every task with determination. She arrived early, stayed late, and studied files during her lunch breaks. Her hands often ached from hours of typing, but she refused to slow down. The work wasn't glamorous, but she poured her heart into it. Edward occasionally passed by her desk, observing her from a distance. He noticed how she stayed focused despite the whispers and the subtle glances. One evening, as the office emptied, Edward approached her desk. "Still here?" he asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. Maria looked up, startled. "Yes, sir. I wanted to finish these reports." Edward glanced at the stack of papers, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You remind me of someone," he said softly, almost to himself. Before Maria could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her both curious and puzzled. One afternoon, Maria was tasked with delivering a file to Edward's office. She hesitated at the door, taking in the space. The office was vast yet tastefully understated, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city. Her gaze wandered to a shelf lined with awards, books, and photographs. Her breath caught. There, nestled among the items, was a photograph she recognized. It was the same one she'd seen in Edward's car the night of the accident. The woman in the picture looked serene, her features strikingly familiar. "Maria," Edward's voice startled her. He stood at the doorway, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed her lingering by the shelf. "I'm sorry," Maria stammered, stepping back. I I was just looking at the photo. She looks familiar." Edward's expression hardened for a moment, then softened. "She was someone important to me. That's all you need to know," he said, his tone polite but firm. Maria nodded, sensing she'd overstepped. But the image of the woman stayed with her, sparking a flurry of questions she couldn't shake. As days turned into weeks, Maria's curiosity grew. The photograph haunted her thoughts. The woman bore an uncanny resemblance to her late mother. Could it be a coincidence, or was there something more to it? Maria began piecing together fragments of her mother's past during her breaks. Her mother had always been tight-lipped about her younger years, sharing only vague stories. Now those fragments felt like pieces of a larger puzzle. At the same time, Edward found himself drawn to Maria in unexpected ways. Her work ethic, resilience, and quiet determination reminded him of someone he'd once loved deeply. One night, alone in his study, Edward opened an old box tucked away in the corner. Inside were photographs, letters, and mementos from a past he'd tried to bury. He picked up a photograph of Maria's mother, her smile radiant, her eyes filled with life. The resemblance to Maria was undeniable. Edward's hands trembled slightly as he placed the photo back in the box. His mind raced with questions. Could Maria really be? The tension between them grew subtly but unmistakably. Maria began asking more pointed questions about the woman in the photograph, though she carefully masked her curiosity. Edward, on the other hand, remained evasive, his answers vague and dismissive. Yet behind the calm facade, he was quietly conducting his own investigation. He pored over records, piecing together timelines and details from decades past. Each new discovery brought him closer to a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. For Maria, the mystery deepened with every passing day. She couldn't ignore the pull of her instincts, the nagging feeling that the answers she sought were right in front of her. But with Edward keeping his distance and her own memories incomplete, the truth felt just out of reach. Edward sat in his private study late into the night, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. His desk was cluttered with old records, photographs, and letters, remnants of a life he had tried to forget but could no longer ignore. Among the papers was a faded envelope, its edges worn with time. Inside was a letter written in delicate handwriting, signed with a name that had haunted him for years, Eleanor. He stared at the letter, his heart heavy with regret. It spoke of love, sacrifice, and a decision made under the weight of family expectations. Next to it lay a photograph of Eleanor, her warm smile so vivid it seemed to leap off the paper. But what struck him most was the uncanny resemblance to Maria. The timelines aligned. The clues were undeniable. With a deep breath, Edward leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. Could Maria really be? The next morning, Maria arrived at the office, her usual determination masking her growing unease. She had spent sleepless nights piecing together fragments of her mother's past, but the puzzle remained incomplete. As she sorted files at her desk, Edward's assistant approached. "Mr. Gray would like to see you," the assistant said curtly. Maria hesitated, then nodded, her stomach nodding as she made her way to Edward's office. When she entered, she found him standing by the window, his back to her, staring out at the sprawling cityscape. The air was thick with unspoken tension. "Maria," Edward began, his voice measured but laced with emotion. "Please sit." She obeyed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Is something wrong, Mr. Gray?" she asked cautiously. Edward turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he said nothing, as if struggling to find the right words. Finally, he spoke. "There's something I need to tell you," he said quietly. "Something about your mother." Maria's eyes widened. "My mother? What about her?" Edward walked to his desk and picked up the photograph of Eleanor, handing it to Maria. Her breath caught as she stared at the image, her fingers trembling. This is her," she whispered. "But how?" "She was more than just a woman from my past," Edward said, his voice breaking slightly. "Eleanor was my first love. We were young and foolishly in love, but my family didn't approve. They pressured me to end things, and I gave in. I walked away, and I've regretted it every day since." Maria looked at him, disbelief etched across her face. "Why are you telling me this now?" Edward's gaze softened, his eyes searching hers. "Because I believe Eleanor had a child, and that child is you." Maria froze, her mind reeling. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You're wrong. My mother never mentioned you. She never—" "She wouldn't have," Edward interjected gently. "She was proud, strong. She wouldn't have wanted you to carry the burden of my mistakes." Maria stood abruptly, the photograph clutched tightly in her hand. "This doesn't make sense. You're just saying this to ease your guilt." "Maria, please," Edward said, stepping closer. "I've spent the last few weeks piecing this together. The timelines match, the resemblance. Everything points to this truth. I'm not saying this lightly." Maria's chest heaved as she struggled to process the revelation. "If this is true," she said finally, her voice trembling, "then why now? Why not years ago?" Edward's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he looked vulnerable. "Because I didn't know. I didn't even know Eleanor had a child. And now that I do, I want to make things right." Edward sank into his chair, his head in his hands. "I was a coward, Maria. I let my family dictate my life, and I lost the one person who meant everything to me. And now I've found you, and I'm terrified I'll lose you too." Maria stared at him, her emotions warring within her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to walk away and never look back. But deep down, a part of her wanted to believe him. "You don't get to just walk into my life and fix everything," she said, her voice cracking. "You don't get to erase years of struggle with an apology." Edward looked up, his eyes glistening. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Maria. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for a chance to be the father I should have been." For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the city outside. Finally, Maria took a deep breath, her grip on the photograph loosening. "I need time," she said softly. "Time to process this. Time to decide if I can believe you." Edward nodded, his expression somber but understanding. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." Weeks passed, but the tension between Maria and Edward slowly gave way to something gentler. Their conversations, initially formal and cautious, grew warmer. Edward began sharing stories of Eleanor, how she loved to sketch by the riverside, how her laughter could brighten even the darkest days. Maria listened intently, piecing together a picture of the mother she thought she already knew. For the first time, she felt a sense of belonging she couldn't quite explain. Edward, in turn, made efforts to bridge the gap between them. He invited Maria to dinner, not in the grandeur of his mansion, but at a small, cozy diner Eleanor had once loved. Over simple meals and shared memories, they began to rebuild what had been lost. One afternoon, Maria stood outside a rundown building in her neighborhood. The peeling paint and cracked windows hinted at years of neglect, but Maria saw potential. "This could be it," she murmured, her eyes lighting up. With Edward's financial backing and Maria's unwavering determination, the space was transformed. What was once a forgotten corner of the community became a vibrant center for underprivileged youth. Children filled the rooms, their laughter echoing through freshly painted walls. Art classes, tutoring sessions, and a small library brought life and hope to those who needed it most. Maria stood in the middle of it all, watching the children with a mix of pride and gratitude. Edward joined her, his hands in his pockets. "Your mother would be proud," he said softly. Maria smiled, her eyes misty. "She always told me to dream big. I think this is what she meant." Edward's transformation was no less remarkable. The once aloof and ruthless businessman began to take a step back from the corporate world. He redirected his wealth toward charities and initiatives that supported education and healthcare. Board meetings and high-stakes deals no longer defined him. Instead, he found fulfillment in giving back. At one such charity event, Edward took the stage, a microphone in hand. His speech was brief but heartfelt. "For too long, I let my success blind me to what truly matters. Today, I'm choosing to leave a legacy not of wealth, but of compassion." The final scene brought the story full circle. A small crowd gathered at the grand opening of Maria's community center. Edward stood among them, watching proudly as Maria stepped onto the modest stage. She held a microphone, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice was steady. "When I was younger, I used to dream of a life where I could make a difference," she began. "But life wasn't easy. My mother taught me resilience, kindness, and the importance of helping others. Today, this center isn't just a dream come true. It's a way to honor her and all that she stood for." Her gaze shifted to Edward, who met her eyes with a small, proud smile. "I've also learned the power of forgiveness. None of us are perfect, but it's never too late to change. Family, love, and kindness. These are the things that truly matter." The crowd erupted in applause as Maria stepped down, her heart full. Edward approached her, his eyes brimming with emotion. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said quietly. "And she'd be proud of you too," Maria replied, her voice soft but firm. As the camera pulled back, the center sign came into view. The Eleanor Gray Community Center. Children played in the yard, and the laughter of a new generation filled the air, a testament to the power of redemption and the enduring strength of love.